The conflict in Ukraine worsens as Russia continues its assault on cities across the country. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Russian forces continue to bear down on the Ukrainian capital Kyiv, with heavy fighting reported in the suburbs. Several cities have been hit across Ukraine and there is a growing humanitarian crisis, according to the United Nations. Close to 3 million people have fled the country. Both sides continued to talk on Monday but failed to reach a breakthrough. Talks are expected to resume on Tuesday. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president had this to say.
We have to hold on. We have to fight. To win, to come to the peace deserved by Ukrainians, fair peace, with security guarantees for our state, for our people, and to put it on paper, in negotiations, difficult negotiations.
In a few minutes, our panel will weigh in on the latest situation, but we begin with a Russian perspective. I talked earlier with journalist and analyst Dmitry Babich, who joined me from Moscow. Dmitry Babich, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Dmitry, what's the view from Moscow? A Kremlin spokesman said, and I'm quoting here, that all plans set out by the Russian leadership will be realized within the approved time frame. What does that mean? What is President Putin's aim here?
Well, the spokesman of the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, who used this expression, is a former diplomat. So he used sort of a vague expression in order to give his boss as much leeway as possible. But in general, what we can say is that the two stated goals of the military operation in Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine and denazification of Ukraine, these goals Putin is determined to achieve. What do I mean by demilitarization? Any regime that will be established in Ukraine after the war should not be hostile to Russia. It should not be like the current regime, where both President Zelenskyy and President Poroshenko before him threatened that they could acquire missiles that could hit Russia, that they could develop even nuclear weapons, as Mr. Zelenskyy said, at the Munich conference recently, when he said that Ukraine can leave the so-called Budapest Agreement. And by denazification, I think Putin means the end of discrimination of the Russian minority in Ukraine. The big question is how can this, how can this end of discrimination be achieved? There is a soft way to do it, which is to introduce some kind of a new legislation in Ukraine that would protect the Russian-speaking people, or maybe the regions like Donetsk and Lugansk, which are predominantly Russian, they should get special rights, maybe sovereignty.
Dmitry, how does Ukraine pose a threat to Russia? Russia has one of the most powerful militaries in the world. How does Ukraine pose a threat?
Well, there are already American bases and British bases on the territory of Ukraine. Some of them were called training centers, but there were hundreds of American and British military operating there. And the Russian intelligence reported that weapons could soon arrive. And basically, I repeated, President Poroshenko said, and President Zelenskyy confirmed it, that it was possible for Ukraine to deploy on its territory missiles, maybe foreign missiles, maybe domestically made missiles that could threaten Russia. Let me remind you that part of the territory of Ukraine is just 400 kilometers away from Moscow. 400 kilometers is basically 4 or 5 minutes for a modern missile. So if Ukraine became a de facto NATO member, and it was a de facto NATO member, NATO didn't have any obligations towards Ukraine, but NATO used Ukraine for deploying weapons and for using this territory against Russia.
Dmitry,
so this was the danger that Mr. Putin perceived.
Right. Those bases that you're talking about, Ukraine says one of those bases, which it described as a training base, was attacked by Russia. It's very close to the Polish border. A number of people died there. Dozens of people, in fact, died, and there were even more people who were injured. The fact that it is close to the Polish border, doesn't this risk the chance that this conflict could escalate, could become a much wider conflict? It could even pit Russia against NATO?
Well, no one in Russia is taking this war lightheartedly. You know, no one is happy about the need to conduct this war. But the base that was hit by Russian missiles next to the Polish border that you just described, this base has been operating for 7 years. For 7 years, hundreds of American instructors were preparing Ukrainian military there to fight Russians, to participate in the operation in the east of the country, where 2 regions, after the illegal ouster of the elected president, did not recognize the new government in Kyiv. So, of course, this is not a peaceful place, that Yavorovsky place, which was hit by Russian missiles.
Right. Right.
And of course, it is perceived as a threat by Russia.
Yeah, you say nobody in Russia is taking this war lightly, and that is true. Nobody in Russia is taking it lightly. In fact, we've seen thousands of Russians take to the streets in Russia opposing this war.
Well, I think in 2014, I remember, the protests were much more numerous. Today, they're not numerous. I mean, thousands of people for a country of 142 million people is not many. And the reason why the mood changed and why Russians are a lot less opposed to military action than in 2014 is something that was admitted by the Western media. For 8 years, the Ukrainian army has been waging a war against 2 of its own regions populated by Russians. We had more than 1 million refugees from there, which told us how they were treated, how they suffered. So during these 8 years, there was a change in public opinion in Russia. This is very important. You know, Putin's nationalist critics who say he should have done it in 2014 when the Ukrainian army was much weaker, they do not take into account a very important element, and that element is Russian public opinion. Yeah. Russian public opinion became more critical of the Ukrainian regime during the last 8 years.
Okay. Dmitry, is this just about Ukraine? Because there are many questions being asked right now. There's a lot of debate going on about the ultimate aim of Russia. Is it just about Ukraine, or does President Putin have bigger ambitions?
I think it's just about Ukraine, but of course a very strong message is sent to other neighboring countries, which showed themselves to be very hostile towards Russia during the last 25, 26 years. The attitude in these countries, and I mean Georgia, Moldova, the Baltics, they kept talking about the possibility of Russian attack, but at the same time they continue to be very rude and provocative towards Russia. So the feeling here in Moscow was that these people do not take us seriously. They don't really believe that this attack is possible. Now, after the Russian military action against Ukraine, they are taking us a lot more seriously. Let me remind you that Georgia and Moldova were 2 countries that didn't join anti-Russian sanctions. Why? Not because they love us more than before, but because they see the example of Ukraine. So, in a way, I think Putin tried to send a diplomatic message first, cultural message, he failed, so he is now sending a military message.
What happens, those demands that President Putin has made, demilitarization of Ukraine, the denazification of Ukraine, the Russians have also called for an assurance that Ukraine will not join NATO, that it will be a neutral state. What happens if those demands are not met?
Then the military operation will be conducted to the end, and the regime ruling in Ukraine will be ousted, just like legally elected President Yanukovych was ousted with the Western support in 2014. The question is not who will do it, Mr. Zelenskyy or his successor. Someone has to declare Ukraine a neutral state, which will not become a member of NATO. Of course, it's better to do it with Mr. Zelenskyy because he is considered by Russia to be a legally elected president. But if Mr. Zelenskyy can't do it, he will be ousted and the new government will be created, which will do it sooner or later because I think the majority of Russians and Ukrainians want a neutral status for Ukraine. It's obvious that Ukraine, as a NATO member, is dangerous for Russia and dangerous for itself.
Okay, but wouldn't Russia pay a huge cost for this? I mean, the country is already the target of some of the harshest sanctions we've ever seen imposed on a single country. Russia may go through with this military campaign. It might militarily subdue Ukraine, but those sanctions are not going to be lifted. They're still going to be there.
Well, first, it's obvious that we are talking about huge amounts of money and that stakes are very high in this game. But even before the Russian military action was started, Russia was an object of many sanctions. And the language used against Russia was very, very hostile. So basically, I think it was a mistake of the West because Putin didn't feel like he was going to lose much if he uses military force, simply because the West was so hostile. So out of the two evils, just to sit idle and wait until NATO gets right next to Moscow. It's already right next to St. Petersburg after it took Estonia in. So instead of just waiting for NATO to come, Putin decided to act. Yes, I think to a certain extent it's a gamble, but that gamble is better than just passivity. I think this is the way Putin thinks about it, because passivity is death. At least you do something, at least you try. Right. Because the Western hostility has not been subsiding in all of these 20 years.
Dmitry Babich, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, that was Dmitry Babich talking to me earlier from Moscow. Well, time now to hear from our panel. Joining me from Kyiv is Inna Sovsun. She is a member of the Ukrainian parliament. With us too from Berlin is Ulrich Brueckner. He is a European Studies professor at Stanford University in Berlin. And also joining the discussion from Rhode Island is Vladimir Goldstein. He is chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University and a commentator on Russian foreign policy. Welcome to all of you to the show. Inna Sovsun, I want to start with you. We just heard the view from Moscow there, from Dmitry Babich in Moscow. And if I could just recap some of what he said. He talked about the demands that Russia is making on Ukraine, denazification, demilitarization. He talked about that military base that was attacked by the Russians, saying that Ukraine has been host to a number of military bases that have been used by NATO countries in Ukraine. And he also said that militarily, if Russia does not subdue Ukraine, there would be regime change. What's your response?
Well, it was very difficult for me to listen to that because just 30 minutes ago, I did look at the picture of a 5-year-old girl. She was staying at her home with her parents when the Russians airstriked, they attacked her house, the residential building, and because of the strike, she lost her left arm. A 5-year-old kid who lost her left arm fully because of the Russian attack. And then I'm looking at this picture, and then I'm hearing this idiot, this Russian Kremlin-paid propagandist, saying that they're doing the denazification over here. They are the real Nazis of our times. They're killing Ukrainians. They have already killed 100 Ukrainian kids. They're attacking residential areas. They're specifically killing the infrastructure here in Ukraine, not the military infrastructure. And they're blatantly lying. We do not have a single NATO base here in Ukraine, and we never did. And he also forgets that Russia attacked Ukraine 8 years ago, in 2014, when we were officially a non-allied and neutral state. And now he's saying that they attacked us because we are hostile. No, we are hostile towards Russia because they attacked us 8 years ago, not vice versa. He is also saying that there are some other countries which are hostile to Russia, and he's given examples: Georgia, which was attacked by Russia in 2008, Moldova, where Russia basically took part of the territory. I do believe that Russia should look at what they have done to other countries, and they continue doing here in Ukraine to a much, much bigger level, and just stop this blatant lie being dispersed all over the world. Because they're killing Ukrainian kids now, they're attacking residential areas, they're holding 400,000 people hostage in the city of Mariupol, and not allowing a single person to leave that city. They're sitting there without electricity, without heat, without anything to eat or to drink water. And he is talking here about denazification. That is just, it's unbelievable.
The picture that you are painting there, the story that you are telling us, it's a very bleak story, it's a very grim story, it's tragic in many ways. Peace talks have been taking place. Both sides talked again on Monday. What are the chances of a breakthrough? What are the chances of there being some kind of a diplomatic solution to this?
Well, I wish there was a diplomatic solution, but you are hearing the Russian side. They do believe that they're denazifying, what is the word, Ukrainian state. Look at me, I'm representative of the parliament. Do I look like a Nazi to you or to anyone else here? So I don't think there is a line for compromise, because the situation is like this. They want us dead, and we really want to stay alive, and we are fighting for our lives here. And there are very little thin lines in that. The only hope that I'm having is that the Russian army, which was claiming to be so strong and so powerful, is now actually asking China to provide food for the Russian soldiers. That is basically, again, because the Russian state is so much used to lying to everyone that they have been lying to themselves. And they were lying to themselves, saying that they have this super strong army, which now is in dire need of food. So that is giving me hope that the Ukrainian army will fight back and we shall kick them out of our country. But the talks themselves, well, that really depends on whether the pressure on Russia in terms of sanctions is strong enough for the Russian elite to pressure Putin to actually stop war against Ukraine.
Okay, just for the record, China has dispelled those claims that Russia has been asking for food or military equipment. But I want to move on to Ulrich Brueckner in Berlin. Ulrich, there was that Russian attack on that military training center in the western part of Ukraine near the Polish border. Russia has warned that it will target arms supplies that are coming into Ukraine, that it will target these training centers. And I'm wondering, are European leaders worried that this kind of action could expand this war into their countries as well?
Well, of course they are. Because on the one hand, NATO was very clear from the beginning that it will not fight a war against Russia on Ukrainian soil, because NATO sees itself as a defense alliance and it defends its members. And bad luck for the Ukraine, they are not members of NATO. And so it's only indirect support by providing military equipment and everything else NATO could do to stay out of the conflict. There's always a chance that a rocket hits NATO territory or that someone makes a mistake. But for the time being, NATO tries to stay out and support Ukraine, not because Ukraine is an upcoming NATO candidate or something. That was written in the Ukrainian constitution, but it was not on the agenda of NATO.
We just heard from Dmitry Babich in Moscow tell us that that base that was hit was used for years by Americans to train Ukrainians to attack Russians. Should that have taken place? Should Ukraine have been used by the Americans to train Ukrainians to attack Russians, if that is indeed what happened?
Well, after 2000, or after Maidan, and then also after 2014, Ukraine asked the West for help. Because in its position between Russia and the West, it decided that its future of modernization lies in the West. So they asked for support and they got support. And attacking this particular camp or this facility is a clear signal to Western partners of Ukraine that if we move any further, we are part of the war, although it's not considered to be a war. And that is partly a warning, but I also don't think that Putin will stop anytime soon. And he doesn't make a distinction. As it was said before, it's about destruction, because in my understanding, it's not so much a question of will Ukraine join NATO, but it is as threatening to Russia or to Putin in particular that Ukraine could join the European Union, because the modernization would bring results that make Ukraine comparable with Russia. And in this beauty contest, there's not much an authoritarian regime can offer. If you compare Ukraine with Poland, they were on equal footage when the wall came down.
Right.
And now Poland is 4 times richer than Ukraine. So that is the actual threat. And this is why the destruction is so massive and goes far beyond military facilities.
Vladimir Goldstein, this war has certainly intensified. It's now in its 3rd week. In fact, the US media described what is happening right now. They talked about Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, being bombarded by the Russians. What is your assessment of the status of this war right now and the efforts to resolve it through some kind of negotiation?
Well, in terms of the efforts, I don't see much. Unfortunately, both sides seem to be digging their heels. They don't listen to each other. They call each other's names. They, as we've seen here, they refuse to acknowledge, for example, Russian security concerns, Russian sort of interests, and so on. So I don't see any negotiations, and that's why I think this frustration with the lack of understanding, that Russia is in Europe. It was doing fine. It doesn't have any socialism of previous thing. It's not Soviet Union, which is bent on kind of expanding. This is a modern country which wants to be part of the trade of Europe and work with everything. But what they cannot tolerate is indeed hostile country on their side. And hostility in Ukraine was absolutely obvious. From their, certain, laws to 8 years of war on Donbass. So Russians are concerned. But definitely Ukraine also should concern. Nobody should invade other countries to prove their point. So what we see here is a very serious and tragic situation, which both countries have to look at each other and recognize. Russians should recognize Ukrainian concerns. Ukrainians should understand Russians. And here it's very important. Where is Europeans here? Why on earth everybody repeats what a State Department tells what's going on in Europe, right there in front of their nose? There should be Germany. There should be France. There should be other countries making these 2 countries, Russia and Ukraine, make some kind of a deal. There are plenty of examples like that. There's like neutral Austria, neutral Switzerland. They're doing very well. They're not obeying to Russians. They're just doing what European countries are supposed to do: trade, prosper, and do this thing. I don't see impossibility of that. But the only demand for that is for people to look at each other faces and talk normally, rather than calling Nazis idiots. This is not a conversation. This is childish conversation. And until it continues, I'm afraid there will be a bloodshed. That's the situation. And definitely Russians are much stronger military, and they will accomplish these goals until Ukraine and Europeans sit down, and the United States, and negotiate.
Sovsun, Ukraine has been asking for a no-fly zone to be imposed over Ukraine. We've also seen a massive humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Up to 3 million people have been forced to leave their homes and their country. NATO has said no to a no-fly zone. Do Ukrainians feel that they're in this fight alone?
Well, first of all, I will just shortly comment on what the professor over here just said, saying that Austria is a neutral country. Well, right, but not a single part of Austria is annexed by any single other country, and neither is Switzerland. And I believe if anyone tried to annex a part of Switzerland, that would really be a cause of concern for Switzerland itself and for the claims of neutrality. So please do not say that Ukraine was hostile to Russia, because it was Russia that annexed part of Ukrainian territory, and that is a fact that no one is even debating about. As for the no-fly zone, that is a real issue for us, because right now I'm hearing sounds over the city of Kyiv with Russian planes trying to attack the city again. They're attacking civilian population. They're killing people every single day. There was an airstrike early this morning in Kyiv. That is what they're doing. So yes, we're asking for a no-fly zone. We are not asking for the NATO troops to ensure the no-fly zone, but we're at least asking for the jets and air defense so that we can save our civilians, the lives of our civilians and the lives of our children. And we do feel that not enough is being done by the West to ensure that, but we shall keep pressure and we shall keep asking to save our lives.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left, and I'd be grateful if you could keep your answers very short. Ulrich Brueckner, both Chancellor Scholz of Germany as well as the French President Emmanuel Macron, they held talks with Russia before this conflict began. And I'm wondering, was this a failure of European leadership that could have prevented this conflict?
I don't think so, because when you look at how long this invasion has been planned, Putin was testing the West. He invited or listened to every diplomatic approach and every visitor who came to Moscow. But I think he was very clear about what he's planning to do, and no action from the Western side would have prevented this.
Vladimir, we were talking earlier about President Putin's ultimate goals in Ukraine, and as we heard from Dmitry Babich telling us that what Russia wants is denazification, is demilitarization, a neutral Ukraine, a Ukraine that would not threaten Russia in any way. How does that happen? Who enforces that? Who makes sure that Ukraine's security will be secured?
I think if, the situation will continue like that, what I foresee is basically splitted Ukraine. What we have to be aware of that eastern part of Ukraine, there are many people there are Russian speakers, and they are, they were very sympathetic to Russia. I don't know how it will continue now, but, we're talking about Mariupol. Civilians there, 400,000 civilians are actually captured by this absolutely nationalist right-wing battalions who have nothing even to do with the Ukrainian army. They are acting like ISIS. They're holding people. They're holding.
So, one moment, Ina. I'll give you a chance to respond. Vladimir, finish your thought. I'll give you a chance, Ina. Go ahead.
So this eastern Ukraine feels, sympathetic to Russia, and I have a feel, as opposed to, Western Ukraine, who views Russia as a devil incarnate. So I suspect what will happen is the country will be split in two.
Okay.
And, Putin also will make sure that the part which is, remains the West, they'll be degraded military.
Okay, Ina, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but that is just too much. I have friends in Mariupol right now that are being held hostage by a NATO organization, which is the Russian army. They're killing Ukrainians over there. They're killing my friends over there. They have bombarded my native city of Kharkiv. My native city of Kharkiv on the very east of Ukraine, which hates Putin as much as they never hated him before. Trust me.
I have friends there too, so this is a naive conversation.
You don't have any friends here anymore. You don't have any friends here anymore.
I have friends in Mariupol. I have people
here right now. After you were killing our people, after you bombarded our cities.
Okay.
You are not friends to us. And trust me, the only thing that Putin achieved right now is the absolute unity of Ukraine, because the Russian-speaking soldiers on the eastern Ukraine are now doing everything possible to kick out the Russians out of our country.
Okay.
And that is what we need to understand.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. This has been The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for watching.